Hello, and welcome. In this episode, you will learn how to craft behavioral learning objectives using the levels of knowledge in Bloom's taxonomy. First, you will be introduced to some suggested readings to prepare you for the information that will be presented. Then, you will see the objectives of this learning episode. Then, you will get some information about creating learning objectives, a little review of Bloom's taxonomy, and finally a chance to demonstrate that you've learned what you need to successfully craft behavioral learning objectives for your courses. In the bottom right-hand corners of every slide are navigation buttons. If at any time you need to move ahead or leave the PowerPoint and then return, those buttons will guide you through the presentation. Before we begin, if you would like to look at the lesson plan for this episode, please click on the upper right-hand corner, the icon that is a picture of a clipboard, and that will take you to a Word document. If you're ready to begin, click the arrow in the bottom right-hand corner and let's get started. Here are 3 suggested readings for you to take a look at before you continue with the presentation. The first article is a good, brief overview of what behavioral learning objectives entail. The second article speaks to the necessity of including a behavior in your objectives and not simply use words like know, understand, or learn. The third article takes a look at how objectives are addressed in different research studies across the different fields involved in education. This episode has 4 learning objectives. The first of which is for you to be able to identify, articulate, and discuss the 3 critical elements of a well-planned behavioral learning objective. Our second goal is to practice manipulating the different action verbs in the levels of Bloom's taxonomy by matching these action verbs with the appropriate level of higher order thinking skills that each one is meant to develop. The third goal of this episode is for you to compare pairs of statements and correctly identify which ones are course goals versus learning objectives. Our last goal is for you to create one or several objectives that include all 3 critical elements to be a complete behavioral learning objective, and hopefully apply these in a course that you are teaching or you will teach. Before you are introduced to the critical elements of a behavioral learning objective and a review of Bloom's taxonomy, it's important to understand what you already know. If you click the purple link that says the space provided on this handout, it will open a Word document on which you have blank space to free write and put down your ideas of what is the difference between a goal and an objective. After you've finished, come back to this slide and continue with the presentation. Now that you've organized your thoughts on the differences between goals and objectives, here are some points for you to consider. Goals tend to be long range, covering the entire class over the course of a semester, and objectives tend to be shorter in their focus, specific lesson objectives, or even the objectives of specific activities, or assessments, or assignments, or projects, whatever the case may be. Goals tend to be much more broad, and they're not always measurable, but they do give students an idea of what it takes to make progress toward the end result of the class. Objectives tend to be much narrower in their focus. They include measurable steps that students have to take towards reaching the target for the lesson or for the day. And they tend to focus on specific behaviors or skills, where goals tend to focus on a specific point of content. In general, goals provide the end point. Where are we trying to get to in this class? And objectives provide a focus. What is our target to reach today in the grand scope of the course? Before you start thinking about daily objectives or assessments or assignments or activities, you really do have to consider the overall goals of the course that you are teaching. What are the end results that you want students to achieve when the semester is over? You have to determine what you intend for them to achieve, You also need to consider what your students expect from the course and from you as the teacher. They may have very different expectations of the course than you do. You might be teaching it because you enjoy the content, but your students may need the content in order to be successful in a future career. You also need to identify how you will measure the progress of your students. This is where thinking about assessment comes in. You should design the assessment first and then go back and plan the activities that you're going to use to build knowledge for students to be successful on that assessment. Your course goals are also going to influence the books that you choose, the instructional strategies that you utilize, and the sequence of your assignments. Finally, you have to make sure that the goals of your course reflect where your course fits in the curriculum of your program. What prior knowledge are your students coming in with? And what do they need to leave your course with to be able to succeed in the next step in the curriculum? You also should consider how your own course goals reflect and support the overall goals of the university. Once you've designed the goals of your course, you've chosen your texts and materials, and you've determined what your assessments are going to be, now it's time for you to craft the behavioral learning objectives that are going to guide each day that you teach. Behavioral learning objectives have 3 critical elements. The first element is action verb. This is telling us what the learners will do. Sometimes in other literature, this is referred to as the behavior, and this is where knowledge of Bloom's taxonomy is going to be helpful. The second critical element is the content or the skill. What are you teaching? Is it a particular concept that students have to master? Is it a technique that they need to be able to demonstrate? That's going to depend on the subject area and the type of course that you're teaching. The third critical element of a proper behavioral learning objective is the criteria or criterion for assessment. How are you going to assess their learning? Hopefully you've already determined this, and so you're working backwards. When you put those 3 pieces together, the action verb, the content or the skill, and the criteria for assessment, that is a complete behavioral learning objective. If any one of those 3 pieces is missing, it's not a learning objective, and it's not really clear to students how they can succeed in your course. Remember, the goal behind behavioral learning objectives is to let students know right from the beginning, how do I reach the target for today? What do I have to do? What do I have to know? And how do I prove to you that I've met the target? Going back to that first critical element of a behavioral learning objective, the behavior verb, we need to consider Bloom's taxonomy. When you're creating your behavioral learning objectives, Bloom's taxonomy is a great place to start to get those objectives to be specific enough for your students to understand exactly what you expect of them. Benjamin Bloom was one of the leading educational theorists when it comes to writing learning objectives, and he's considered the go-to guide for these action verbs that appear in behavioral learning objectives. Bloom's taxonomy categorizes different levels of cognition, and at each level on the chart, you will find verbs that can be used as ways of demonstrating mastery of the content or the skill that you're expecting of your students at each of cognition. Something to keep in mind, though, is not every behavior or action verb on Bloom's taxonomy is measured with a test. A test does not always equal criteria for demonstration of mastery. Sometimes you're just going to observe the behavior. For example, if you want your students to discuss, you may listen on their discussion or participate in the discussion, and that would be enough for you to understand or to see if they've mastered what you wanted them to get out of the class that day. Another example, comprehension is another verb that's difficult for teachers to think beyond a test. Students can demonstrate that they understand the material by reteaching others or by creating questions for class discussion. You can see from the chart that Bloom's taxonomy has 6 different levels of cognition. At the very bottom, in the smallest circle, you have remembering. This is basic recall of facts, defining, listing, repeating, basically memorized recitation of content. In the second level of taxonomy, students reach understanding phase with the knowledge that you're trying to give them. And this is where students need to be able to explain ideas, classify things, describe, discuss, recognize, translate, paraphrase. Those are all good behavior verbs for the understanding level. The third level of Bloom's taxonomy is the application. And this is where students use information in a new way. So they demonstrate things, they interpret, write about things, they can illustrate, sketch, solve, operate, dramatize. In the analysis level, students are distinguishing between the different parts of the concept or the content or the skill that you're trying to impart on them. In this level, you'll find behavior verbs like differentiate, distinguish, question, examine, compare, contrast, criticize. Evaluation level, the students should be able to justify a stand or a decision or an opinion about the content that you're presenting. So argue, defend, judge, support, evaluate, appraise are all good behavior verbs. And at the highest level of Bloom's taxonomy, which you will not reach on a daily basis, and that's okay, is the creation level. This is where the student is going to use the information that they've gained and create a new product or a new point of view to demonstrate their understanding. So constructing, creating, designing, formulating, writing, developing, assembling, these are all good creation verbs that you can use if you're pushing your students to this highest level of cognition. Before we go any further, let's see if we've learned anything about Bloom's taxonomy. Take the quiz below and see how you do. In this guided practice, the purpose is for us to determine which of the statements is a goal and which of the statements is an objective. Carefully consider both of the statements below, decide which is the goal and which is the objective, and then click the arrow in the bottom hand corner to move to the answer and see if you were correct. Let's try one more guided practice. Again, read the following statements and decide which one is the goal and which one is the behavioral learning objective. Then click the arrow in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen and see if you were correct. Now let's make sure we really understand the 3 critical components of a good behavioral learning objective. Read each statement and identify which of the 3 components are missing. If all of the components are present, then simply know that none are missing. After you've thought about the statement, click the arrow at the bottom right-hand corner of the screen and see if you are correct. Hopefully, you realize that none of the parts of the behavioral learning objective are missing. This, in fact, is a very well-crafted behavioral learning objective. You have the behavior, creating, you have the assessment, the chart, and you have the skill, the correct process for creating a PowerPoint presentation. This behavioral learning objective is clear. It tells the students what they're going to learn, how they're going to demonstrate it, and how it's going to be assessed. Let's try another one. Take a look at this statement and decide which of the 3 critical components of a good behavioral learning objective, if any, are missing. Then click on the arrow in the bottom right-hand corner and check your answer. In this statement, we're missing the assessment piece of our behavioral learning objective. Students will compare two different poems about the Civil War. That gives us the behavior, compare, and the poems. But there's no assessment actually stated here. To make it clear to your students, you should add something to the end that lets them know how they're going to compare them, whether it's in writing, in class discussion, in a debate, or with a partner. Now that you've reached the end of this episode on behavioral learning objectives, it's time for you to apply this to the course that you are going to teach. My suggestion is that you write behavioral objectives for the course or the training session that you're going to teach that falls into the lower 3 levels of Bloom's taxonomy. And then try and write another objective for the same course that pushes your students to one of the top 3 levels of Bloom's taxonomy. Remember, keep in mind that you need to have all 3 critical elements of a behavioral learning objective for students to clearly understand what you expect of them. You need to have the behavior verb, you need to have the content or the skill, and you need to have the criteria for assessment. When you're finished, ask yourself if those behavioral learning objectives clearly articulate the content, the expectation, and the method of assessment to your students. If you need help, there is a link at the bottom of this slide to an interactive diagram of Bloom's taxonomy that should make writing your behavioral learning objectives a lot easier. Hopefully, this presentation and the activities contained within it have given you a good idea of what it takes to craft a proper behavioral learning objective. Remember, you want to give your students as clear a target as possible for each day in class, as well as carefully thought out long-range goals that cover your entire semester. If you need further clarification on behavioral learning objectives or Bloom's taxonomy, or simply would like help writing these things for your course, please contact the Citadel for further information.